The rain hit the glass walls of the tall Berlin skyscraper like a soft rhythm of warning. Inside, Alexander Gray sat silently in the back of a sleek black car, his heart beating faster than usual. The city outside looked cold and distant, but inside his chest burned a storm of excitement and fear. Today was not just another meeting. Today was the meeting, the one that could change his entire life. At only 32, Alexander had built one of the fastest-growing tech companies in America. Reporters called him a genius. Investors called him a risk-taker. He called himself a man who got lucky, but deep down he knew luck had nothing to do with the work that got him here. The car stopped in front of a massive building made of steel and glass. The name on the wall, Kronberg Industries, shone in gold letters. These were the people who could make his dream global. They were ready to invest billions into his company, but everything depended on this one meeting. Alexander stepped out of the car, adjusting his tie. The morning air was sharp and cold, but the nervous sweat on his palms didn't care. He looked at his reflection in the building's glass door. Calm face, sharp suit, confident eyes. He had practiced that look for years. He took a deep breath and walked inside. The receptionist greeted him politely, but her words flew in fast German. Alexander smiled, not understanding a thing, and nodded. She smiled back and called someone to escort him to the top floor. As the elevator doors closed, he stared at the city view below, cars, people, lights, movement, and for the first time he felt small. The translator he had hired, Michael, was supposed to meet him here. Michael spoke fluent German and English, and Alexander trusted him completely. But his phone buzzed with a message that made his stomach drop. "I'm sorry, Alex, fever, can't make it. Please reschedule." How could he reschedule a $3 billion meeting? The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and before he could even think, a tall man in a grey suit approached. "Herr Gray, welcome to Kronberg Industries," the man said in heavy accented English, shaking his hand firmly. "Please come inside. Everyone is waiting." Alexander's throat tightened. Everyone is waiting. Those words echoed in his head. As he entered the large conference room, he was greeted by at least 10 men and women sitting around a long wooden table. The air smelled of coffee and importance. On the far end of the room sat the main investor, Mr. Klaus Kronberg, a man in his 60s with icy blue eyes and a sharp gaze that could cut through silence. "Guten Morgen," Mr. Klaus said with a small nod. Everyone else echoed the greeting in German. Alexander smiled and tried to respond, but his tongue froze. He only knew how to say danke and hello. He nodded awkwardly, hoping it was enough. Mr. Klaus began speaking in rapid German, his voice strong and confident. The others nodded, taking notes, discussing numbers, and pointing at charts displayed on a large screen. Alexander tried to follow the gestures, but the words sounded like music from another planet. Fast, sharp, impossible to catch. He kept glancing at the door, praying that Michael would walk in any second. But the door stayed closed. Minutes passed like hours. The investors were deep into discussion, and Alexander just sat there, the man who owned the company everyone wanted to buy into, yet the only one who didn't understand what was happening. Sweat gathered on his forehead. He took a sip of water to calm his nerves, but even the glass trembled slightly in his hand. One of the investors, a woman with short blonde hair, turned to him and asked something in German. Everyone looked at him, waiting for his response. His heart skipped. Yes, he said with a nervous laugh. The room went silent. The woman frowned. Mr. Klaus leaned back slowly, his cold eyes studying Alexander. Something was wrong. One of the younger men whispered something to another, and both of them exchanged quiet chuckles. Alexander's stomach twisted. He didn't know what he had just agreed to, but judging by their faces, it wasn't good. He tried to speak again, explaining, "I'm sorry, my translator." But before he could finish, Mr. Klaus interrupted in German, his tone suddenly sharp and cold. The air grew heavier. Alexander could feel every heartbeat in his chest. He looked around helplessly, wishing he could rewind time, wishing he had learned just enough German to survive this moment. Finally, one of the assistants switched to broken English. "Mr. Gray, do you understand our proposal?" she asked slowly. Alexander froze. I don't think I do," he admitted. The assistant translated his words back into German. The table erupted in whispers. Mr. Klaus frowned, clearly disappointed. He muttered something to the others, and they all nodded in agreement. The assistant turned to him again, her tone polite but distant. "Maybe we continue another day," she said softly. Alexander's chest sank. That was it. The deal was over before it even began. He had flown across the world, prepared for months, and it all ended because he couldn't understand the language. As he stood up, the investors began gathering their papers, shaking hands among themselves, barely looking at him. Mr. Klaus gave a small nod, a respectful goodbye, but not a warm one. Alexander managed a faint smile, pretending to stay composed, but inside, he felt the weight of billions slipping through his fingers. He walked out of the conference room, his polished shoes echoing in the empty hallway. The receptionist gave him a polite smile as he passed, but he barely noticed. His vision blurred slightly, not from tears but from the heavy mix of stress, anger, and disappointment. He had fought for years to be taken seriously in the business world, and now he had lost everything because of one missing translator and one language he never thought he needed to learn. As he stepped into the elevator, his reflection stared back at him again. Same suit, same confident look, but this time his eyes looked empty. When the doors opened to the hotel lobby, he walked out into the cold Berlin air. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still grey. He walked to a nearby cafe, sat down in silence, and ordered a coffee he didn't really want. The waitress brought it to him with a gentle smile, but he didn't notice her yet. He just stared at the dark coffee, the city outside, and the silent truth inside his mind. He had just lost billions, not because of bad business, but because he didn't understand a single word. Alexander sat by the cafe window, watching the rain slide down the glass like silent tears. The world outside moved normally, people laughing, buses passing, umbrellas opening, but inside him everything was falling apart. His phone buzzed again. It was another message from Michael, his translator. "I'm really sorry, Alex. I'll try to be there tomorrow." Alexander sighed and put the phone face down on the table. Tomorrow didn't matter anymore. The deal was already dead. He rubbed his temples, trying to calm his thoughts. He had spent months preparing. Numbers, presentations, designs, even rehearsing how to greet Mr. Klaus properly. And now it was gone, all because of one simple barrier: language. He had faced business failures before, but this was different. This was humiliation. Losing everything not because of lack of skill, but because he couldn't understand. He felt smaller than ever. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, but even that couldn't comfort him. He stared blankly at the steam rising from his cup. At the other end of the cafe, a few people chatted in German. Their words flowed quickly, softly, and to Alexander they sounded like music he wished he could play. He pulled out his notebook and flipped through the pages filled with his English notes about the deal. He thought about writing an apology email to Mr. Klaus, but what would he say? "Sorry, I embarrassed myself because I can't speak your language?" He closed the notebook, defeated. Then he heard a soft voice beside him. "Excuse me, sir. Are you okay?" He looked up. A young waitress stood there, holding a tray of empty cups. She had kind brown eyes and a quiet face that looked both shy and strong. Her name tag said Lena. Alexander tried to smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a bad day," he said, forcing a laugh that sounded as tired as he felt. She tilted her head. "You look like someone who just lost something important," she said in her gentle German-accented English. He raised an eyebrow. "You could say that," he replied softly. "I just lost billions of dollars." Her eyes widened a little. "Billions?" she repeated, half shocked, half intrigued. He nodded. "I had a meeting with some investors today. It went terribly wrong because I couldn't speak German. My translator got sick. I couldn't understand a word they were saying." He paused and smiled bitterly. "I think they thought I was stupid." Lena's expression softened. She placed the tray down and sat on the edge of the chair across from him for a moment. "That's really unlucky," she said quietly. "But maybe it's not over yet." He chuckled weakly. "Trust me, it's over. I made a huge mistake in there. They asked me something in German. I said yes. And from their faces I could tell it was the wrong answer. After that they stopped trusting me." Lena smiled gently. "Sometimes one wrong word can close a door," she said. "But sometimes one right word can open another." He looked at her, studying her calm expression. There was something peaceful about her presence. Like she wasn't impressed by his money or his title, she just saw a person who was hurting. "You speak good English," he said, trying to change the subject. She shrugged lightly. "I studied it in school. I also work evenings at a small language center. My dream is to teach languages one day." Alexander raised his eyebrows. The morning air in Berlin was fresh and cold, the kind that carried both nerves and hope. Alexander sat quietly in the car beside Lena as they drove toward the tall glass building where his life had nearly fallen apart the day before. He looked out of the window, lost in thought. The streets were wet from last night's rain, and the sky was pale grey, a city still waking up. He could see his reflection in the car window, the same face, the same suit, but this time there was something new in his eyes, determination. Lena sat beside him, holding a small notebook and a pen. She had written down a few key words in German, simple phrases she thought might help him if he got nervous. She looked calm, but inside her heart beat fast. She had never been in a business meeting this important before. But when she saw Alexander's quiet, tense face, she knew she couldn't show fear. "You'll be fine," she said gently. "Just speak slowly, look at them when you talk, and let me do the rest." Alexander smiled, though his voice trembled a little. "You make it sound easy," Lena laughed softly. "It's just people talking to people. Billionaires or waitresses, everyone understands kindness." The car stopped in front of Kronberg Industries. The same tall glass doors stood before him, but today they didn't look as intimidating. He stepped out, buttoned his suit, and looked at Lena. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. "Let's change yesterday." They walked inside together. The receptionist recognized him immediately, but looked slightly confused seeing him with a waitress. Alexander greeted her politely. Lena spoke a few quick words in German, explaining who she was. The receptionist's expression softened, and she guided them upstairs. When the elevator doors opened, Alexander's heart started pounding again. The same hallway, the same conference room, the same people waiting inside, Mr. Klaus and his team. The air felt heavy with quiet judgment. Mr. Klaus's cold blue eyes followed Alexander as he entered. "Mr. Gray," he said slowly in English, his accent thick. "You came back." "Yes," Alexander replied. "Thank you for giving me another chance." Lena stood slightly behind him, notebook in hand. Mr. Klaus spoke again, this time in German, turning to his colleagues. The sound of fast German words filled the room again, but this time Alexander wasn't lost. Lena stepped forward, translating calmly, her voice clear and confident. "Mr. Klaus says he appreciates your effort to return. He wants to hear your proposal again, clearly this time." Alexander nodded. "Tell him I'm grateful for his patience." Lena repeated his words in German. Her pronunciation was soft but firm, and the investors nodded in approval. Slowly, the tension began to ease. He started explaining his company's vision, how his new technology could help reduce production costs for Kronberg Industries by 30%. He talked about innovation, teamwork, and trust. And every time he paused, Lena translated, her voice carrying his passion across languages. For the first time, the investors listened closely. They weren't whispering among themselves. They weren't frowning. They were nodding. At one point, an older investor asked a long question in German. Lena listened carefully, then turned to Alexander. "He wants to know how your system handles international trade laws," she said. Alexander explained as best as he could, while Lena translated every word with precision. She didn't just translate his language, she translated his emotion. The warmth in his tone, the honesty in his voice, the sincerity behind his words, all came through her. Mr. Klaus leaned forward, elbows on the table, watching both of them with interest. The room that had felt like a battlefield yesterday now felt like a bridge being built word by word, but then came a moment that tested everything. One of the investors, the same woman with short blonde hair from the day before, looked directly at Alexander and asked a sharp question in German. The tone was skeptical. Everyone turned to listen. Lena froze for a second, trying to find the right English words. The question was tough, almost insulting. The woman had basically asked if Alexander was only pretending to care about Germany for profit. Lena looked at Alexander, unsure whether to translate it exactly as it was. He noticed her hesitation and gave a small nod. "Say it exactly," he said softly. "I want to answer her honestly. Lena nodded and translated the question word for word. The room went quiet. Alexander stood still for a second, then smiled gently. "Please tell her this," he said. "I don't care about Germany because of money. I care because I believe business is about trust, not language. I came here because I want to build something real, not just something rich." Lena's voice softened as she translated. Her tone carried a quiet strength, almost poetic. When she finished, the room stayed silent. The investors exchanged looks. Mr. Klaus's cold eyes softened for the first time. Then slowly he began to smile. "Sehr gut," he said. "Very good." A small wave of laughter and nods followed around the table. Lena let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Alexander felt his chest lighten. The meeting continued for another hour. Questions, answers, discussions. But now there was trust in the room. When it finally ended, Mr. Klaus stood up and shook Alexander's hand firmly. "Do you speak little German?" he said with a faint smile. "But you speak truth." "That is better." Alexander smiled back. "And I had help," he said, glancing at Lena. Mr. Klaus looked at her curiously, then nodded respectfully. "Good translator." "Smart woman." Lena blushed slightly. "Thank you, sir," she said softly. As they walked out of the building, Alexander felt like the air outside had changed, brighter, lighter. He turned to Lena and said, "I don't know how to thank you," she smiled. "You already did by believing I could do it." They both laughed, a soft, real laugh that felt like a beginning. As they walked down the street together, Berlin didn't feel so cold anymore. For Alexander, the city that had almost destroyed him was now the place where something new had started. Not just a business deal, but a strange, unexpected friendship that would soon mean much more. The next morning, Berlin was glowing under a pale sunrise. For Alexander, it didn't feel like the same city anymore. Yesterday, he walked through its streets as a man who had lost everything. Today he walked through it as someone who had been given a second chance. He and Lena sat together at breakfast in the small cafe near his hotel. The same cafe where he had first met her, the waitress who had changed everything. But this morning she wasn't wearing her uniform. She wore a simple white blouse and a neat grey skirt, her hair tied back, looking both nervous and confident. "Are you sure you're ready for another day of translating?" Alexander asked with a smile. Lena laughed softly. "Are you ready for another day of being questioned by 10 serious Germans?" He chuckled. "Not really. But if you're there, I think I'll survive." They shared a light moment, but inside, both of them felt the same quiet pressure. Today wasn't just another meeting. It was the final round. The day the investors would decide whether to trust Alexander or walk away forever. When they arrived at Kronberg Industries, the air in the building felt different. People greeted them politely. Even the receptionist smiled, a small sign that maybe, just maybe, the investors had talked about yesterday's progress. Inside the grand meeting room, the atmosphere was serious but not hostile. Mr. Klaus sat at the head of the table, his usual cold expression softened by curiosity. He gestured for them to sit. "Mr. Gray," he said in slow English, "today we finish." Alexander nodded. "I understand. And thank you for giving me this chance." The meeting began. Charts appeared on the big screen, numbers flashed and discussions grew intense. The investors wanted details. Every calculation, every risk, every promise. Alexander spoke clearly, focusing on his vision, while Lena translated with perfect rhythm. She didn't rush. She didn't stumble. Her words carried weight, her tone steady, her eyes full of quiet confidence. At one point, one of the investors, a serious man with glasses, interrupted sharply in German. Lena translated quickly. "He says your plan is too risky. Too much trust, not enough guarantee." Alexander took a breath. "Tell him this," he said calmly. "Every great business begins with trust. You can have contracts and lawyers, but without trust you have nothing but paper." Lena repeated his words. Her voice echoed softly in the room. The investors looked at one another. Some nodded slightly, others took notes. Mr. Klaus leaned back, studying Alexander carefully. Then came another challenge. The same blonde woman from before spoke again, her tone doubtful. "How do we know your company won't fail in 1 year?" she asked in German. Lena translated. Alexander smiled faintly. "Tell her this," he said, his voice steady. "If it fails, I'll come back here myself and explain why." In German, Lena laughed quietly before translating. And so did a few of the investors. Even Mr. Klaus allowed himself a small grin. The tension began to melt. As the hours passed, the room that once felt cold now felt almost warm. Alexander wasn't just giving a presentation, he was telling a story. And Lena was his voice in another language, turning every sentence into something real. Her words carried his heart, and that changed everything. When they took a short break, Alexander stepped aside near the window, gazing at the Berlin skyline. "You're incredible, Lena," he said softly. "I couldn't do this without you," she smiled shyly. "You're giving yourself too little credit. You're the one with the vision." He shook his head. "You gave that vision a voice." The next day, the city of Berlin felt brighter than ever. For Alexander, the grey clouds of failure had finally lifted. The deal with Kronberg Industries was now real, not just on paper, but in promise. Still, a small part of him couldn't believe it had happened. He kept replaying the moment Mr. Klaus shook his hand, the soft click of the pen signing the contract, and the way Lena smiled through it all. He stood on the hotel balcony, the morning breeze brushing against his face. Down below, the streets were already alive, taxis honking, bicycles rushing past, cafes opening. He took a deep breath, feeling something he hadn't felt in months. Peace. Behind him, the door opened softly. Lena stepped out, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You forgot breakfast again," she said with a grin. He turned and smiled. "You really don't stop saving me, do you?" She handed him a cup. "You saved yourself, Alexander. I just made sure they understood that." They stood together for a moment, watching the sunlight spread over the rooftops. For a man who once thought success was built on numbers and strategy, Alexander was now realizing that life's biggest moments often came from unexpected people and unplanned kindness. Later that afternoon, they were invited back to Kronberg Industries for the official signing ceremony. It was the final step, a few signatures, photos, and congratulations. But for Alexander, it wasn't just business anymore. It felt personal, almost like a story finding its happy ending. When they arrived, the large boardroom looked less intimidating than before. The investors greeted him warmly. Even the blonde woman who once doubted him smiled politely. Mr. Klaus stood at the end of the table, holding a fountain pen, ready to complete the deal. As the papers were laid out, Alexander looked at Lena sitting quietly beside him, her notebook closed, her hands folded neatly. She didn't belong to this world of billion-dollar contracts, but somehow she fit there perfectly. Mr. Klaus began, speaking in German, explaining the details of the agreement. Lena translated softly, word by word. Everything was going smoothly, until suddenly one of the younger investors interrupted with a sharp question in German. His tone was quick, challenging. Lena frowned slightly as she listened. The man spoke faster and faster, almost testing her. The question wasn't just about business, it was about trust. He doubted whether Alexander could really handle such a large partnership without deep cultural understanding. Lena looked at Alexander, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "He says, he's not sure if you understand the heart of German business," she translated carefully. "He thinks maybe you'll make mistakes again." The room went silent. All eyes turned to Alexander. The confidence he'd gained suddenly wavered. For a second, he felt the old fear creeping back, the feeling of being an outsider, of being judged for what he didn't know. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Lena did something no one expected. She stood up. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady. She looked directly at the investor and spoke in German, her voice clear and strong. No one moved. Even Mr. Klaus leaned back, listening closely. "I know he doesn't speak our language," Lena said in German, her tone passionate but respectful. "But I've spoken with him for 2 days now. I've seen how he listens, how he learns, how he respects this country and the people in it. He doesn't need to speak German to understand trust or honesty or kindness. Those things need no translation." The room stayed frozen. Alexander could feel his heart pounding as he watched her. He didn't understand every word she said, but he could feel the emotion in her voice, the courage, the sincerity, the quiet power. When she finished, there was silence. Then, slowly, Mr. Klaus began to clap. The others followed, first softly, then louder, Lena's face turned red. She quickly sat back down, whispering, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to—" Alexander stopped her with a smile. "No," he said softly. "You meant every word, and I've never been prouder." Mr. Klaus stood, smiling. "Miss Lena," he said in English, "you speak with heart, and sometimes heart is more powerful than business." He turned to Alexander. "Your company has a good future, but more importantly, you have good people beside you." Alexander nodded, emotion heavy in his voice. "Yes, I do." The signing went on without another problem. When Mr. Klaus finally placed his signature on the final page, the deal was done. A $3 billion partnership, saved not by power or money, but by honesty and faith. After the ceremony, everyone gathered for photos. Cameras flashed, hands shook, smiles spread. But amid all the celebration, Alexander only saw one person, Lena, standing quietly near the window, her eyes shining with pride and disbelief. He walked over to her, still holding the signed contract. "You did it," he said softly. She laughed. "We did it." "No," he said, his voice gentle but certain. "You saved it. You spoke when I couldn't. You gave them a reason to believe in me." Lena shook her head. "I just told them the truth. They saw the same thing I did." He smiled warmly. "And what did you see?" She looked at him for a moment, her brown eyes soft. "Someone who doesn't give up, even when he doesn't understand the words." He chuckled quietly, touched. "Then I think I owe you more than just a thank you." She smiled teasingly. "You already paid me with a story I'll never forget." As they left the building, the golden evening sun bathed the city in a soft light. Cars passed, people hurried by, but for Alexander, time seemed to slow down. He walked beside Lena, their steps matching naturally. He didn't know what the future would bring, for his company or for himself, but one thing was clear. That young waitress who had appeared out of nowhere hadn't just helped him win a deal. She had reminded him what truly mattered: humility, courage, and connection. As they reached the corner of the street, Lena turned to him and said, "You know, Mr. Gray, maybe it's time you start learning some German." He laughed. "Only if you're my teacher." She rolled her eyes playfully. "We'll see." But she smiled, that kind of smile that hinted this was only the beginning of something bigger. And as they walked away, the city lights came on, shining like quiet witnesses to the moment that changed both their lives forever. The deal was done. The papers were signed, the cameras were gone, and the echo of applause had finally faded. Yet, as Alexander walked through the grand marble lobby of Kronberg Industries, he felt strangely quiet inside. The noise of success had never felt so still. Lena walked beside him, holding her small handbag, looking a little out of place among the suits and security guards. She didn't wear fancy clothes and her shoes weren't made for power meetings, but somehow she had fit perfectly in the story that changed everything. Outside, the Berlin air was cool and gentle. The sky carried a soft orange glow as the sun began to sink behind the buildings. Alexander stopped for a moment, looking up at the skyline. He felt a deep sense of relief, but also something else, something softer he couldn't quite name. Lena noticed the silence. "You did it," she said quietly, breaking the stillness. He turned to her and smiled faintly. "No," he said. "We did it." She laughed a little, shaking her head. "You know, I still can't believe any of this happened. Yesterday I was just serving coffee and cleaning tables, and today—" She paused, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Today I helped a billionaire close a deal." Alexander chuckled. "Then maybe the universe knows how to send the right people at the right time." They began walking slowly toward the hotel. The street was busy, tourists snapping pictures, buses passing, people chatting in German all around them. Alexander didn't understand a word, but this time it didn't bother him. He looked at Lena as she smiled at the city lights, and he realized something. He didn't need to understand every language to feel at home. When they reached the hotel entrance, he stopped again. "Lena," he said softly, "you never told me. Why did you help me? You could have just walked away that day." She looked thoughtful for a moment, then smiled. "Because you looked lost," she said simply. "And I've been lost before. Sometimes all it takes is one person who doesn't walk past you. Her words struck something deep inside him. He had spent his life chasing numbers, profits, and headlines, yet no one had ever spoken to him like that. He smiled gently. "You're not just a waitress, Lena," she laughed. "Maybe not, but I still have to be at work tomorrow morning." He smiled wider. "Not if I offer you a new job." Her eyes widened. "A job?" "Yes," he said, "as my translator and cultural guide here in Germany. I'll need someone I can trust, and I can't think of anyone better." She blinked, almost speechless. "Alexander, I don't know if I'm the right person for that." He looked at her kindly. "You're exactly the right person. You believed in me when no one else did. That's worth more than any degree or experience." For a long moment she didn't answer. Then she nodded slowly. "All right," she said softly, "but only if you promise one thing." He smiled. "What's that?" "That you'll finally start learning German." He laughed out loud. "Deal." Over the next few weeks, their lives began to intertwine in quiet, beautiful ways. Alexander stayed in Berlin longer than planned. Every morning, Lena met him at the cafe near the river, the same one where she used to work part-time. She brought him coffee, corrected his pronunciation, and laughed whenever he messed up a word. Sometimes they sat outside, watching boats glide down the Spree River. Sometimes they talked for hours about life, about her dreams of studying languages and his loneliness hidden behind all his wealth. 3 months later, Berlin had become a second home for Alexander Gray. The man who once couldn't understand a single word of German now walked through the city streets with quiet confidence. He still made mistakes when speaking, but that didn't matter, because now every word carried a memory and every place held a story. His company's new European branch was finally ready to open. Reporters, investors, and business partners from all over the continent gathered at a grand glass building near the river. It was the biggest event of his career, the official launch of Gray International Europe. But that morning, as Alexander stood in front of the mirror, straightening his tie, his reflection felt different. He no longer saw the cold businessman from before, the one chasing perfection and numbers. He saw someone humbler, calmer, more alive, someone who had learned that not every deal was about money. Some were about people. There was a knock on the door. "Come in," he said. Lena stepped in wearing a simple white dress. She looked elegant, almost glowing. "Everyone's waiting downstairs," she said softly. He smiled. "And you're still making sure I don't forget anything," she laughed lightly. "Old habits." He hesitated for a moment. "Lena, before we go, thank you for everything, for helping me when I had nothing to offer." She looked at him with warmth. "You didn't have nothing, Alexander. You just needed someone to remind you who you are." He took a slow breath. "Then you reminded me better than anyone ever could." The event began with music and cameras flashing. Guests filled the hall, rows of suited men and women, translators with earpieces, flashing screens showing the company's logo. At the front, a large stage waited with 2 microphones and a golden plaque covered by a red cloth. Alexander stepped up, the crowd falling silent. He looked out at hundreds of faces, but his eyes found only one, Lena standing quietly at the back, her hands folded in front of her. He began speaking slowly, carefully, some in English, some in German. His accent wasn't perfect, but his effort drew soft smiles from the audience. "Today," he began, "we celebrate the opening of our new branch in Berlin, something I dreamed of for years. But what most of you don't know is that just a few months ago, this dream almost ended before it began." He paused, looking around. "I came to this city full of confidence, and maybe a little arrogance too. So I thought success spoke only one language, business. But I was wrong." The audience listened closely. "I was in a room full of investors, people I needed to trust me, but I couldn't even understand them. I was lost, completely lost. I was about to lose billions because I couldn't speak their language." A quiet murmur rippled through the room. He smiled softly. And then something unexpected happened. Someone I had never met before, someone who worked not in an office but in a cafe, decided to help me. She didn't do it for money. She didn't do it for fame. She did it because she cared. Lena's eyes widened. She looked around nervously as people started turning toward her. Alexander continued, his voice deep with emotion. She translated for me, yes. But more than that, she translated my heart when my words failed me. She showed me that kindness doesn't need a language, and that sometimes the smallest voice can change the biggest destiny. He turned slightly toward the back of the room. Lena, would you come up here, please? For a moment she froze. Everyone's eyes turned to her. Slowly, shyly, she walked toward the stage. Her heart raced. She never liked attention, and now hundreds of eyes were watching her climb the steps. When she stood beside him, Alexander smiled warmly and handed her the second microphone. This, he said to the audience, is Lena Fisher, the woman who changed everything. The crowd broke into applause. Flashing cameras lit up the stage. Lena looked overwhelmed, her cheeks flushed, her hands trembling slightly. You don't have to say anything, Alexander whispered softly, but she smiled shyly and said into the microphone, I just did what anyone with a heart would do. The audience applauded again. Touched by her simplicity, Alexander turned back to them. Today, as we open this company, I want everyone here to remember one thing. No matter how powerful you are, never forget the people who stand quietly beside you. They are the real reason behind every success. He looked back at Lena and smiled. And for me, that person is her. The applause grew louder, filling the hall like a wave. Cameras flashed non-stop. Some people even wiped tears. Lena looked up at him, her eyes glistening. When the ceremony ended, the reporters surrounded Alexander, asking questions about the company, the deal, the market. But his answers were short. He wasn't thinking about headlines. He was thinking about the woman who stood next to him, the one who had taught him that kindness could change the course of a life. As the crowd slowly left, he and Lena stepped outside together. The air was cool, the evening sky painted in soft shades of pink and gold. Berlin looked peaceful, just like the first day they met. But this time everything was different. They walked silently along the river until they reached the bridge. The water shimmered below them. Alexander turned to her. Lena, he said softly, you once told me you helped me because you saw someone who was lost. She nodded gently. He smiled. Now I think I've found something even more valuable than my company. She looked at him curiously. And what's that? He took her hand. You, she blinked, her breath catching. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she smiled. That quiet, honest smile he had come to love. You finally said something that doesn't need translating, she whispered. He laughed softly. Guess I'm learning. They stood there, hand in hand, as the city lights reflected in the water below. The world around them moved fast in cars, people, voices. But in that moment, time felt still. For Alexander Gray, the man who once thought success was measured in billions, the richest thing he had ever found wasn't in a contract or a boardroom. It was standing right beside him, a simple, kind-hearted waitress who taught him that love, like kindness, speaks in every language. Weeks passed after the grand opening of Gray International Europe. Berlin had slowly returned to its normal rhythm, busy streets, the hum of trams, and the chatter of people in cafes. But for Alexander and Lena, life was quietly changing again. They spent their mornings together at the office, working side by side. Lena was now officially his cultural assistant and translator. Everyone in the company respected her, not because she was close to the boss, but because of her kindness and the calm way she handled people. But as the company grew, so did Alexander's responsibilities. More meetings, more flights, more late nights. He often stayed up in his office overlooking the city, watching lights blink from the rooftops, thinking about what he might lose again if he wasn't careful. One evening, Lena entered his office with a small smile. "You're still working?" she asked. He rubbed his forehead and looked up. "Trying to finish this proposal for the investors in London. They want me to move part of the headquarters there next month." Her smile faded slightly. "Move to London?" He hesitated. "Only for a while," he said softly. "But they want me there full-time for at least 6 months." Lena's heart sank, though she tried to hide it. "That's good news. You deserve it." He looked at her closely. "Do I?" he asked quietly. "Because every time I get closer to success, it feels like I'm walking away from something more important." She looked down. "You're not walking away. You're following your dream," he sighed. "Maybe, but lately I've been wondering if I'm chasing the right dream." There was a silence between them, Not awkward, just heavy. The kind of silence that carries words left unspoken. Days turned into weeks, and soon Alexander's departure for London was only a few days away. Everyone in the office prepared for the transition, meetings, documents, farewell dinners. But the closer the day came, the quieter Lena became. She still smiled when she saw him, still brought him coffee, still asked how his day was, but her laughter didn't sound the same. One afternoon, while she was organizing files in his office, she found a small box on his desk. Curious, she opened it slightly. Inside was a delicate silver pendant shaped like a compass. There was an engraving on the back. "Home is where you are." She froze, her eyes softening. Then she quickly closed the box and set it aside, unsure if it was meant for her. That evening, when everyone had left, Alexander walked into the quiet office and found her still there. She was sitting by the window, looking out at the glowing city. "You should be home," he said softly. "I didn't feel like leaving yet," she replied, her voice calm but distant. He walked closer. "Is something wrong?" She shook her head. "No. I just realized how fast everything changes. A few months ago I was serving coffee. Now I'm working in offices I never dreamed of. And soon you'll be gone again." He sat beside her. "Lena," he said gently, "when I go to London, I want you to come with me." She turned to him, surprised. "Me to London?" "Yes," he said. "You're part of this story now. I can't imagine starting a new chapter without you there." She hesitated. "Alexander, my life is here. My family, my friends, my world. I don't belong in your world of billionaires and meetings." He shook his head. "You belong wherever your heart takes you. And my heart—" He stopped, his voice softening. "My heart stays with you." Lena looked at him, her eyes glistening. "You'll have everything there, power, success, recognition. You don't need me." He smiled sadly. "That's the thing. I don't need you. I want you."